everybody. Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 130 of the Movement Debrief. And today, folks, we be flexing. Because we're going to talk about functional muscle contractions. What does that even mean? I don't really know. I don't really like it, but it was probably the best phrase that I could come up with because I had a bunch of questions that have been asked by the people. They will be answered for the people by this people right here, Fam Recognized Fan. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first question comes from my dear friend, Bald Thunder himself, Raj. Here's what Raj asks. How can I tell if something is being held in place and can't change position? And how can I tell if it's something that can't move any further because it's already there? AKA a door that can't close because it's already closed. Awesome question. So what Raj is asking about basically is how, from a mechanical standpoint, do movement restrictions happen? The issue he's running into is, for example, like let's say we bring my son into the mix and we're talking about hip flexion. If I have a limitation in hip flexion, how do I tell the difference between something that's a restriction of range of motion of stuff on the back side of the hip, so think like glute max or hip extenders, versus if I'm already in a hip flex position and I can't go any further because I'm hitting the end range position. So that's the two differences that Raj is talking about. And although initially, back in the day when I was kind of learning this stuff, I was under the impression that you could have a restriction by bumping into end range, bony blocks, things of that nature. But after learning a lot from Daddy-O Pops Bill Hartman, who I'll link in the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com/muscle-contraction, that's not really what's going on. And also, too, if you look at some of the research, and I'll link this study in the show notes, that looks at bony contact or lack thereof when we're moving, the bones never touch. And that is likely due to hydrostatic pressure within the joint and potentially some other factors as well in terms of magnetic properties of water, among other things. Although the latter part, there's not a whole lot of evidence beyond basic sciences that support that. But we do know, at least based on one study that I've come across in the knee joint, that there is no contact of the bones. So then it's not necessarily that you're running into each other and problems ensue. The way things become restricted, as of our understanding right now, and this is the way I'm operating, is if I have a loss of hip flexion, for example, the only way I can have a loss of hip flexion is if there is a concentric bias of hip extenders that are limiting my range of motion. For example, let me get my grandson to illustrate this because my son's just too tall. When I have a concentric bias towards hip extension, we'll say, these muscles are going to be concentric, maybe shorter, and although I don't really like that term, but shorter. And when these muscles contract, there's increased synovial fluid presence on the front side of the joint. The reason why you then can't get into hip flexion is because of the relationship of those tissues not being able to slosh the synovial fluid in the opposite direction. It's like I have this large fluid presence in the front side of the joint, and the tissues on the front side cannot contract enough because they're eccentric to push the fluid on the posterior aspect of the joint. Problems ensue. Therefore, you have a restriction. That's the only way you can have a restriction, is if I have concentric bias on one side and an inability to overcome the fluid shift to create movement in the opposite direction. That's how movement becomes limited. What we have to consider, and this is where I think the issue is when we think of someone being concentric or eccentric, we think of this as an on-off switch. So for example, and the example I always use is the elbow. If I have a concentric bias on the front side of the elbow, so my bicep is, pow, huge. It's not that I have maximal concentric contraction of the elbow flexors in the bicep. It's I have a bias. I have a slight bias in tension towards the elbow being in flexion. So it might only be like this amount of tension. But it might be enough of tension that I would limit my ability to extend the elbow. If I had a situation where the door was completely closed, as Raj was talking about, or I have maximal concentric bias of the elbow flexors, pow! I would not have any ability to extend the elbow. And that's not what we're dealing with, right? That would be the one situation where I can't get any more flexion because I'm already there. But we never run into that unless we have someone who's got a severe contracture of some sort, or there's severe changes in the joint surfaces that would create an inability to get any range of motion anywhere. But that's very few and far between. What we're likely dealing with is biases, slight biases in tension in one direction versus the other. So if you have someone who can't get full hip flexion, that's because they have a slight, or depending on the degree of restriction, moderate bias concentrically of the hip extenders. And that's limiting the fluid dynamics that are needed to get into hip flexion. It cannot be you're already there unless you have maximal concentric bias of those tissues. But then you wouldn't have any range of motion going in the opposite direction. And it's just a different way of looking, or like a slight contention point that I've had in times past. But again, having looked at fluid dynamics and joint motions a bit differently, as well as reviewing some of the studies that show that your bones do not touch when you move, I think this is a much more accurate representation as to why motions become limited. To summarize your great question, Raj, the reason why a motion becomes limited has to be because there's concentric bias in one direction and a slight eccentric bias in the other. If we're talking about the elbow as an example, if I can't get full extension, the only way that I have a loss of elbow extension is because there's a slight or moderate concentric bias into elbow flexion that is increasing fluid presence on the posterior aspect of the joint, and that individual may have an inability to create that fluid shift in the opposite direction. Then, if you want to get that mo beta, your activities need to focus on creating that fluid shift, and if you do those things, you ought to be in business. Great question, Raj. The next question comes from my other dear friend, Andrew. Here's what Andrew asks. I'm wondering about pursuing extreme flexibility. How much of this capacity is genetically and or structurally determined? For example, myself, not me, but Andrew, I've pursued these types of ranges and made very little progress. 2, how is pursuing this level of mobility, how would that fit or clash within my model? And 3, how and if this can be achieved without long-term consequences? Andrew, this is an awesome question. I'm glad you asked this. So we have to look at which type of body types are more predisposed to having extreme flexibility, because this is definitely going to be genetically and to follow along that structurally determined. For example, if you are built like an NFL lineman, there's a good chance your gymnast career is going to be short-lived. On the flip side, if you are built like a gymnast, chances are you're not going to reach elite level powerlifting status. So there is some structural biases at play. Which structure is going to be best served to pursue extreme flexibility? Well, I'm glad you asked. The structure that's going to be better at pursuing extreme flexibility has to have an eccentric bias throughout many parts of the body. If we're comparing infrasternal angle types, narrow versus wide, the narrow infrasternal angle is more of an eccentric orientation or eccentric bias. This is why if you look at elite level gymnasts, especially female gymnasts, most of them have very narrow rib cages, and a lot of times when they're doing their finish, you'll see the increased anterior to posterior dimensions. That skeletal structure innately has more flexibility than someone who has a wider infrasternal angle presentation. That doesn't mean that someone who's got a wide ISA can never be a gymnast, because sometimes you will have infrasternal angle presentations who are wide who do have a fair amount of flexibility, but they're likely not going to be as good as the person who's narrow. Let me give you an analogous example. I've known some people who are pretty good collegiate level runners who have wide infrasternal angles. But if you look at the elites, most of them have a particular body type, and that's narrow infrasternal angle, and they have a very narrow pelvis as well, because that's an efficient body structure to perform that task. Just because you have a particular structure, it doesn't mean that you can't pursue this activity, but your ceiling may not be as high as someone who's built for this. And that's just the facts of life. Some people are built to excel at activities. This is why we have things like genetic freaks at the elite level. The other thing to consider when pursuing extreme flexibility is, when did you start this process? I had this discussion with a friend of mine. She's getting into running now, and she's never been a runner. She was actually an elite level gymnast. And she says, Zach, I didn't run for 2 weeks, and I felt so out of shape. And I talked to some of my friends, and they're saying, gosh, you know, I could run 3 miles or 4 miles right now, no problem. And it's like, how in the heck does that happen? The issue is, when did you start developing these adaptations? Like me, for example, I grew up as a runner. I ran starting in my freshman year of high school, and I ran all the way to my senior year of college as a cross-country and track athlete. And I haven't ran in a hot minute because I hated running. The only reason I pursued running was because it was something that I was kind of good at. But like, I would rather be a sprinter, but I wasn't good at sprinting. But that's neither here nor there. But I would throw money down right now that I could probably, and it's been years since I've gone on a distance run, but I could run 5 miles, and my cardiovascular system wouldn't be the rate limiting step. I might get in pain because my tissues might not be used to running on pavement for 5 miles, but that's not the limiting step. And the reason why that is because I pursued those adaptations that are needed for running, eccentric cardiac hypertrophy of the left ventricle, among other things, at a young age, when my body was malleable and adaptable. Therefore, that's always something that I could probably pick up a lot faster than a person who hasn't pursued those adaptations in later in life. My friend, for example. Now, in her case, she was a very high-level gymnast. If she didn't do any flexibility training for a very long time, and she goes in and starts doing yoga or dancing or gets back into gymnastics, she would pick it up and get those eccentric adaptations that you need at the body significantly faster than someone who's starting later on in their career. So if you haven't done some of these things that require tissue adaptations or structural adaptations to be successful at an early age, your ceiling probably isn't going to be as high. This is true of a lot of things. Like, why is it easier for kids to learn new languages than it is adults? It's because they have the plasticity to do so. Why is it easier to play or learn a musical instrument when you're a kid versus an adult? Same thing. That doesn't mean it can't be done, but it's a little bit more of an uphill battle. So with that in mind, Andrew, if you don't have a structure that's predisposed to pursuing extreme flexibility, and you didn't go after those adaptations at a younger age, you have 2 strikes against you that will limit your ceiling of adaptation that you can get when pursuing extreme flexibility. And that doesn't mean that it can't be done. It's just you have these strikes against you. And if you don't have a body that's built for that, you don't have the tissues, the tissue adaptability is limited, that could, I'm not saying it will, but that could predispose you to being more easily succumbing to injuries, more so than if you had those adaptations. And of course we can talk about load management and things like that because that's important, but we're just talking about some of the baseline things that would make someone be successful in these endeavors versus not. So if you are that person who may not have the best structure for extreme flexibility, or you don't have those adaptations that you achieved as a kid, you just want to make sure you're pursuing this type of flexibility with an appropriate amount of load management, and you're working with the guise of someone who's well versed in this field in terms of pursuing that extreme flexibility in a safe and healthy manner. The next piece would be, how would pursuing this level of mobility fit in or clash with my model? So for me, my bias is I want the people who I'm working with to have an appropriate amount of movement options to pursue whatever it is they want to do. Extreme in flexibility or extreme in stiffness, so flexibility, gymnast, stiffness, power-based sports or strength-based sports, that is desirable to some degree to excel in those sports. But it might not be the best thing from a health perspective, and that's okay. What you have to do in that case, if you want to pursue extreme flexibility, is you just have to make sure that as you're doing that, if you're running into issues, you might need to swing back and teach yourself to create an appropriate amount of stiffness in certain areas so you hit that sweet spot of movement options. Also, too, a lot of times with people who do have extreme flexibility, they still have movement restrictions in certain directions. A common thing that I see when I'm working with people who are very flexible, and I've worked with quite a few gymnasts or dancers in my day, is they still have limitations in things like hip extension, or they still have limitations in axial skeleton measures. One thing you have to watch for if you're doing a lot of table testing with someone who is very flexible is they might have Gumby measures on the table when you're looking at the extremities. But a lot of times what will be limited is things like dynamics of the infrasternal angle, also looking at neck rotation. You can look at breathing of the rib cage and things like that, although that's a little bit less useful in my opinion. But a lot of times those measures will be limited on these people. You'll also, if the table seems squeaky clean jelly bean, many times what I'll do for those clients is I'll see how they do in standing activities and try to appreciate whether they can or cannot move well in those environments. A lot of times when you change the context, you have them perform things under load, they still falter and they lose the stack, among other things. So that might be something you need to look into when you're assessing extremely flexible people. How can this be achieved without long-term consequences? We talked about this. The appropriate thing is, or the biggest thing I should say, is load management as you're pursuing this stuff. If you don't have the structure for it, and you don't have the adaptations, you have to make sure that you're progressing in an intelligent manner and in an appropriate manner that doesn't put the tissues beyond their physiological capabilities. That's when problems and pain can ensue. And also make sure you're doing enough supportive things to the tissues, keeping your movement options open in areas that you're predisposed to being restricted. If you do that, chances are you'll be able to pursue this type of adaptations with fewer or reduction of risk of injury. And that's how I would go about working with someone who's got extreme flexibility. Key points, if I may summarize your amazing question, Andrew. First thing, it is structurally determined. Narrow ISA people have more of an eccentric bias, so they're more likely to be successful, especially if they've pursued flexibility at a younger age. Does it clash with the model? Not necessarily. We just have to make sure that extremes, if we're getting into pain or there's reductions of health and that person deems it's undesirable for them, we need to try to bring them back to the middle. And if you're going to pursue these types of things, just make sure you're managing load appropriately and you're choosing progressions that are best for you. Awesome question. The next question comes from Kyle. And here's what Kyle asks. In previous debriefs, I've heard you mention the role of muscles in compressing or expanding, for example, the serratus anterior's role in compressing the ribcage laterally. I was wondering how I would go about learning more regarding the roles of different muscles in compression and expansion, and how this information could be applied in exercise collection and progressing and regressing movements. This is a good question, Kyle, and I wish I had a better answer for you, because I haven't come across many textbooks that look at because like the serratus anterior and compressing the rib cage, there's not really many textbooks that look at the proximal function of muscles and what they act as. Most of them look at distal actions. So a lot of what you have to do is, and a great app that I like is Complete Anatomy, is you have to just look at the anatomy and see what the line of pull is on those muscles, on their proximal attachment, and what they would do. For example, if you look at the trapezius and you see that it attaches to the spinous process, if I pull the proximal attachment towards the distal attachment, you can see that it would be involved in contralateral rotation of the spine. So if I contract the left trapezius, my spine is going to rotate to the right, and that's because the spinous processes get pulled to the left. And that's really probably the best way that you can appreciate proximal functioning. Now, the language of compression expansion, I would simply interchange that with concentric being compression, eccentric being equated with expansion. So you can still apply the same principles. That language is a bit useful because it's a little bit more in line with the language used in physics when we're talking about changes of shapes and space. But interestingly enough, and I don't know where I sit with this, but if you look at the three states of matter, solid, liquid, and gas, really the only thing that's compressible is gases. So when we talk about compression, we're talking about molecules getting closer together. And it's hard for that to happen in water, at least in the human body, and it's definitely damn near impossible for that to happen in solids like your bones. But gases, it can. And it makes me think, and you know, this is just me hypothesizing, so take that for what it's worth, is maybe that's one reason why we see a lot of concentric bias and movement restrictions in the thorax, and it's because that's where most of your gases are in your body. So it's tough to say to what extent we are getting compression and expansion of tissues and the human body in general. So if you want to not get lost in some of the terminology, I've been gravitating a lot more to concentric, eccentric, because that's what we know. But from a physics standpoint, compression expansion makes a lot more sense. I know that I sometimes talk a lot about specific muscles, but what I think is much more useful is thinking about what type of position you're trying to get the body in, and think about how the body has to change and move in order to get into the position desirable. So you talked about the serratus anterior compressing the lateral rib cage. Well, that's a really useful thing when I do something like side bending. So if I side bend to the left, the rib cage on the left side has to be more concentric or close together, so I get pulled to that side. And then on the right hand side, the rib cage has to expand and move apart. So if you think of it in those terms, even if you are not well versed in the anatomy so much, you can start to think about how I need to position the body in order to get some adaptation. So for example, in that case of side bending, if someone has an inability to side bend to the left, you may need to increase the ability to concentrically bias the rib cage on the left and eccentrically bias or expand the rib cage on the right. And that's really the best way I would say you could go about this. So look at the anatomy. Get an app like Complete Anatomy, because then you can look at the three-dimensional representation of muscles a lot better, and you can get angles you may not see in a typical textbook. Do that. Do a little bit of a thought experiment to see how these things move. And then another thing too, and this is something I need to challenge myself more on, is see if you can fact check that with research. For example, there's some interesting study. I don't know if I will find this, so check the show notes. I may have it, I may not, where they did a extension manipulation to the thoracic spine, and that increased EMG activity of the trapezius muscles, whereas a flexion manipulation did not, which makes you think that, well, then maybe increasing extension in the thoracic spine gives the trapezius more concentric bias or leverage to act, and hence the increased EMG activity. So that could be another thing you could do, is to fact check yourself by also looking at some research to see if there's anything to support that. But to me, what's more important is just looking at the body, looking at how it moves, looking at how the body has to change and adapt to a given movement, as opposed to sweating specific muscles. But if you're feeling frisky and you get all hot and bothered about muscles, because I do, I'm a nerd like that, look at the anatomy, see how the proximal actions would occur, and if you do that, you might have a better idea in terms of how muscle actions can influence how we move. Awesome question. The last question comes from, I hope I pronounced your name well, Inyaka. Here's what he asks, or she, or they, I don't know, I'm sorry. Inyaka, please correct me. Hi, Zach. I just saw your debrief about reaching mechanics. And I was talking with a colleague, and we have one doubt. He said that if you reach overhead, you will compress the upper thorax naturally due to the upward rotation of the scapula, plus when you add load, which is compression, you will further induce compression. But on your debrief, you said reaching overhead facilitates T2 to T4 expansion. Do the mechanics differ under load? Thank you. Great question. So I would disagree with your colleague on one piece, but I would agree with him on another piece. Stay tuned, because I'll piece that out for you. When I go overhead, the resting position of the scapula, if you look at the Ludwig article, which she's about as boss as it gets when it comes to any research of the shoulder, so check her out, and I'll link that study in the show notes. The resting position of the scapula is about 41 degrees of internal rotation, with about 5 degrees, I believe, of upward rotation, and a slight anterior tip. And in that position, if I breathe in, I'm going to have the ability to expand, or I'm going to have eccentric bias of the posterior thorax. And that's going to stay consistent for about the first 60 degrees of shoulder flexion. So in this situation, you will get some ability to expand the upper thorax, or the posterior thorax. Now, because I'm not in full upward rotation, there's going to be some relative concentric bias of the downward rotators. So you may not get as much expansion in the upper part of the thorax, T2 to T4. Now here's where your friend is talking. So he's saying, as you now initiate upward rotation, which is 60 degrees and beyond, you get a concomitant external rotation of the scapula. So that's going to create some compression or concentric bias in the posterior thorax. That doesn't mean that it's completely sealed off, though. Because remember, I'm starting from a 41 degree internal rotation bias. So I'm going to have some degree of compression or concentric bias in the upper thorax, limiting my ability to expand. Now here's the interesting thing when we're talking about scapulohumeral rhythm. Once you hit about 120 and you go all the way to 180 overhead, you're definitely getting progressive external rotation and upward rotation. But interestingly enough, you got two things going on here. You have an increase in humeral external rotation. If I have external rotation of the humerus, boom, I'm going to have a relative internal rotation at the scapula. That's because your external rotators create internal rotation at the scap. That's piece one. Piece two, when you hit full overhead, the scapula, because it's sliding along the lateral aspect of the rib cage, orients into the scapular plane, which is about 45 degrees from abduction forward. It's like a midpoint between flexion and abduction. That angle actually biases internal rotation of the scapula, even though the movement is external rotation and compression of the lateral rib cage. So that's going to give you some posterior expansion. The other piece here is as I upwardly rotate the scapula, the downward rotators now become more eccentrically biased. The ones in the back are your rhomboids. Those run from C7 to T5. So that's going to allow for some expansion into those segments of the rib cage. And the thing we want to be careful with on this is we're talking about gradients. This isn't on-off switches. So it isn't, okay, from 0 to 60, I get the most posterior expansion from T6 to T12 as humanly possible, and then as soon as I hit 61, boom, it shuts off. It's not that. It's gradients. Some people can still get some posterior expansion there. Someone who is super flat in the thoracic spine, you're going to have a bad time. Same thing as I'm going to fully overhead. It doesn't mean that it's going to be this huge fill into posterior expansion, and that's why we use exercise to manipulate that to bias more fill. For example, I may get more posterior expansion at T2 to T4 if I tip someone upside down, because the lungs will feel superiorly to inferiorly, as opposed to when you're standing, it feels inferior to superior. So we have to think of this in terms of gradients. So I would potentially, if we're assuming normal mechanics, disagree with your colleague when we're talking about unloaded overhead activity. But now, here's the key contention point. Your friend also said that when you're under load, you're going to get increased compressive forces. And I would agree with that 1007%, which isn't even possible, I don't think. I'm going to keep it 1000 with you, though. With that, anytime I have to produce force, I need concentric activity of muscles to complete that action. And the heavier it goes, the more that demand increases of the tissues. So if I'm pressing hella weight overhead, which, good Lord, one, you're never going to see that from your boy, but two, if you do see me doing that, it's not going to be pretty. But if I were to do that, I'm going to need maximal or a substantial amount of concentric contraction of my tissues. So in that case, I actually may get a larger degree of compression or concentric activity in the posterior thorax, limiting my ability to expand. That's why a lot of times when you see someone doing like a heavy overhead press, they have to arch their back. And if you look back in the day when overhead pressing was an Olympic sport, you had these people who would do these deep arches for that reason. It's just because you can't get the expansion in that position. And when you get to more of a horizontal leverage, you can rely on passive tissues or make it more like a horizontal press. So I agree with your colleague there. The mechanics definitely change under load. This is probably one factor that contributes to people who pursue heavy loaded sports, powerlifters, bodybuilders, why they have more concentric bias, and that's because that's what they're training. To summarize your great question, Inyaka, unloaded, you will get some posterior expansion if we're talking about overhead mechanics just because of scapulohumeral rhythm. Fact check me, look at the Paula Ludwig article because she outlines basically that dynamic that I discussed. But when you're under load, you need more muscle tension to move them heavy ass weights. Hashtag Ronnie Coleman. You need that. So you're going to have more concentric activity or compression in areas to be able to complete the tasks. The mechanics change under load. I think that's a good stopping point for us today. I want to thank all of you beautiful, sexy, outstanding people for tuning in. You've been an amazing audience. I'm sorry that your boy has been off the debrief game for the last 2 weeks. It's been a little crazy with the Supreme clientele, but I'm back, ready to rock and take care of you wonderful folks. If you want to learn more, here's where you can find me. First, go to zachcouples.com. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter because I got so much free stuff for you, it's not even funny. You'll get the Common Compensations Workbook, which is there to simplify your coaching. You know, you work with people and you're like, ugh, I don't even know what type of weird thing that they're doing. I simplify it into 1 or 2 strategies. Check that out. You'll also get access to Human Matrix Foundations, my free course, which goes over a lot of the basic anatomy and biomechanics you need to get the most out of debriefs and other content that I have. You'll get about 5 hours of talks. You'll get a free acute chronic workload calculator, and we'll be in touch every Friday with all types of goodies on the internet. If you want to see what type of stuff I'm reading and getting into, or if you want, like I shared a cool sleep study thing. If you want that, or if you're a hip-hop fan, it's a must because I try to stay on the up and up with hip-hop as well. It's the most important research, in my humble opinion. Once you've scoured zachcouples.com and you subscribe to the newsletter, you also want to check out the services that I offer on my site. There's quite a few of them. The first is a movement consultation. If you are that person who is getting this crazy arch when you're pressing overhead and you're like, man, it doesn't feel good on my shoulders. What can I do to improve my movement? Well, you can do a movement consultation with your boy because we will take you through a full movement assessment. I will figure out what areas you're restricted on. We'll design activities to help improve your mobility so you can do the wild, crazy things you want to do. You can do that from a fitness perspective as well with me through online training, but unfortunately, I am not taking new clients. If you do want to hop on the wait list, please do that. You can still go to the site and do that. Or if you want to learn how to apply some of these concepts with your clients, whether it's training, whether it's rehab, you want to work on, you want to start an internet business like your boy, you need some guidance in that regard, I can help you with that through my mentorship program. I am taking clients for that, so please check that out. When COVID isn't happening, I also offer a live seminar called Human Matrix where you can get in-person coaching, assistance, learn how to assess movement, how to apply these concepts under low intensity and high intensity. That is the place to do it. If the COVID gods shine upon us, I have one seminar this year as of right now, and that's November 7th and 8th in Charlotte, North Carolina. I have a bunch of dates for 2021, so peep those. They'll be in the show notes. Once you've consumed everything you could possibly consume on zachcouples.com, you'll want to check me out on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. Because guess what, folks? There's 129 other debriefs out there, and we didn't have cool backgrounds. We didn't have dual cameras back in the day. You might not want to look at me. I had a scruffy beard sometimes. Never had hair, though. So you definitely might want to check us out there. While you're there, though, please leave a review so the fam can keep growing. Last places you can find me is all over the social medias. I'm on Facebook and Twitter. Just search Z Couples. Of course, I'm on that Instagram, baby. Zach, Z-A-C, Couples, C-U-P-P-L-E-S. And I'm also on YouTube. Search Zach Couples if you want to see the newest activities that I'm performing with my Supreme clientele and you want to learn which ones are going to be good for my restrictions or which ones you want to play with. Definitely check me out on YouTube. Thank you so much for tuning in. You've been a beautiful, sexy, outstanding audience. I hope that you're safe and healthy during these wild, crazy times. Keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving, and I'll see you next time. Deuces.